School shootings are tragedies that leave behind a ripple effect of pain, anger, and unanswered questions. When the name Colt Gray, a 14-year-old boy, was tied to a shocking school shooting, it shattered the illusion of innocence we often associate with children. What drove a boy so young to commit an act so devastating? What happened inside those school walls that turned an ordinary day into a national nightmare? As details emerged, the nation's attention turned not just to Colt, but to the system, the community, and the people impacted by his actions. President Joe Biden weighed in, celebrities shared their outrage, and a heated debate reignited over gun laws and mental health in America. In today's video, we'll delve deep into Colt Gray's case, unravel the events that led to the shooting, the fallout for the victims' families, and the larger implications of this crime. Stay with us as we explore the chilling details and ask the question, how did this happen? The morning of the shooting began like any other, a crisp, cool day where students prepared for another routine day of classes. It was a Wednesday, the middle of the school week, and the mood in the hallways was lighthearted. Laughter echoed off the lockers as students chatted about homework, after-school plans, and the upcoming basketball game. Teachers greeted their students with warm smiles, and the first bell signaled the start of what everyone assumed would be an uneventful day. But no one could have anticipated how that morning would unravel, how it would forever change the lives of the students, the faculty, and the families who entrusted their children to that school. Colt Gray walked into the school like any other student. He was quiet, his demeanor giving nothing away. And yet there was something different about him that morning. Something subtle but unsettling. He carried a backpack just like hundreds of other kids, but inside was something no one could have imagined. The day before, Colt had stayed up late, pacing in his room as a storm brewed within him. For weeks, he had been battling an invisible battle, one no one seemed to notice. Social media posts hinted at feelings of isolation, cryptic messages about being misunderstood, but they were dismissed as teenage angst, shrugged off by peers and adults alike. Colt wasn't a troublemaker. If anything, he was the type to fade into the background. Teachers described him as polite but reserved. He rarely spoke up in class, and his grades were unremarkable. To most, Colt was just another kid trying to navigate the turbulence of adolescence. But beneath the surface, there was a darkness building, a storm fueled by rejection, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of being unseen. The school's security cameras later revealed Colt entering through the back doors at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before classes started. He moved with purpose, walking down the empty hallways toward the locker area. His expression was calm, almost too calm. He wasn't running or hesitating, but his movements had a deliberate precision that, in hindsight, was chilling. In those minutes, Colt's intentions were already set in motion, though no one around him had the faintest idea of what was to come. It was in the crowded cafeteria that the first screams erupted. Students had gathered before the morning bell, chatting and laughing over breakfast sandwiches and orange juice cartons. The sound of a loud bang shattered the hum of conversation, followed by another, and then chaos. Tables flipped over as students scrambled for cover, their trays and books scattering across the floor. Teachers rushed to the scene, some shouting for students to run, others frozen in the shock of the moment. The fire alarm began to blare, but it was drowned out by the cries and confusion. Witnesses later described Colt as eerily calm, walking slowly through the chaos, his focus unwavering. He wasn't yelling or screaming, just pulling the trigger with mechanical precision. His target appeared random, though investigators would later uncover a more chilling truth. Among the students and staff, there were whispers of grudges, of people who had bullied Colt or dismissed him. But in the moment, it didn't matter who he was aiming at. Fear consumed everyone equally. One of the students caught in the crossfire was 16-year-old Ethan Carter, a star basketball player known for his charisma and kindness. Ethan had been sitting with his teammates joking about their upcoming game when the chaos erupted. A bullet struck him in the shoulder, sending him to the ground. His best friend Marcus dragged him behind a flipped table, applying pressure to the wound as they both prayed for the nightmare to end. Meanwhile, other students barricaded themselves in classrooms using desks and chairs to block the doors, their breaths shallow as they texted desperate messages to their families. Outside, the first responders arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the early morning air. Police officers, paramedics, and SWAT teams descended upon the school, their weapons drawn as they prepared to face the unknown. Parents began gathering outside the perimeter, their faces etched with fear as they begged for news of their children. The entire scene was chaos, a horrifying contrast to the calm morning that had started just hours earlier. Colt's rampage ended in the science wing, where he barricaded himself in a classroom. The SWAT team negotiated with him for nearly an hour, their voices echoing through the halls as they urged him to surrender. Colt, still calm, demanded to speak to the principal. Witnesses later recounted his chilling words. "I want people to know why I did this. I want them to see what they ignored." When asked what he meant, Colt remained silent, his eyes vacant, as though the weight of his actions hadn't yet reached him. By the time Colt was taken into custody, the damage was done. 4 students and 1 teacher were dead. 12 others were injured, some critically. The hallways of the school were unrecognizable, littered with overturned desks, abandoned backpacks, and shattered glass. And yet, in the aftermath of the tragedy, the questions began to emerge. Who was Colt Gray, and what had driven him to commit such an unthinkable act? The immediate aftermath of the shooting was nothing short of chaos. The once vibrant school, filled with laughter and the promise of a new day, was now a scene of horror and despair. Sirens blared in the background as first responders rushed to triage the injured and secure the area. Paramedics worked quickly, their hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. Students with minor injuries were led to waiting ambulances, while those critically hurt were airlifted to nearby hospitals. Teachers who just hours before had been preparing lessons now stood shell-shocked, trying to console sobbing students and account for everyone under their care. Outside, the crowd of parents grew. Their faces were a mix of anguish and desperation, eyes scanning the crowd for any glimpse of their children. The school's emergency response system had sent out a vague alert, notifying families of an active situation. It left parents with more questions than answers, and their fear bubbled into anger as time dragged on. Some clutched their phones, frantically texting or calling their kids, hoping for a response. Others stood frozen, clutching each other as they waited for news. Among the crowd was Ethan Carter's mother, Karen, her hands shaking as she repeatedly dialed her son's number. When it went unanswered, she began asking anyone in a uniform if they could tell her something, anything about her son's whereabouts. It wasn't until one of Ethan's teammates emerged from the building, his shirt soaked in blood that wasn't his own, that she learned her son had been taken to the hospital. Relief and panic collided as she rushed to her car, desperate to reach him. But for some parents, there was no relief. When officials began gathering families into a nearby auditorium to inform them of the confirmed casualties, the air turned suffocating. One by one, names were called, and the weight of those words hit like a tidal wave. Grief poured out in wails and cries that echoed through the building. It was a moment that would forever mark the lives of everyone in that room. Meanwhile, law enforcement worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened. Detectives combed through the school, documenting every detail: bullet casings, overturned chairs, bloodstains, each a fragment of the nightmare that had unfolded. Outside, Colt Gray sat handcuffed in the back of a police car, his face eerily calm. Officers noted his lack of emotion, his silence unnerving. He didn't ask about the victims or his parents. He simply stared out the window, as if disconnected from the reality of what he had done. Back at the police station, Colt was placed in an interrogation room, the gravity of the situation palpable even within its sterile walls. 2 detectives, seasoned but visibly shaken, entered the room. They sat across from him, their notepads ready, their questions carefully crafted. But Colt didn't make it easy. He answered their questions in clipped, emotionless sentences, offering no insight into his motivations. "Why did you do this, Colt?" One detective pressed, his voice steady but firm. Colt's response was chilling in its simplicity. "Because I wanted to." While Colt's words offered little clarity, the investigation outside the station began to paint a clearer picture. Authorities searched Colt's home, a modest suburban house that gave no outward sign of the turmoil brewing within. Inside, they found clues that began to unravel the narrative. His bedroom walls were bare, devoid of the posters and photos typical of a teenager. A notebook lay open on his desk, its pages filled with dark, angry writings, cryptic messages about feeling invisible, misunderstood, and ignored. One entry stood out. "Maybe now they'll notice me." The discovery of the notebook sent chills through investigators. It wasn't just a diary, it was a manifesto, detailing weeks of planning and an escalating anger that had finally reached its boiling point. Social media accounts linked to Colt revealed a similar pattern, posts filled with vague warnings and cries for attention that went unanswered. Friends and classmates described him as quiet, shy, and kind of a loner, but few had seen the storm beneath the surface. As news of the shooting spread, the nation reacted with shock and outrage. Politicians, celebrities, and community leaders all weighed in, offering condolences and demanding action. President Biden, visibly emotional during a press conference, called the shooting a tragic reminder of the urgent need to address gun violence in this country. He vowed to work towards stricter gun control measures, though his words were met with both praise and skepticism. The shooting reignited a fierce debate about mental health, gun rights, and the failures of a system that allowed a 14-year-old to carry out such a devastating act. In the days following the tragedy, vigils were held across the community. Hundreds gathered to light candles and share memories of the victims. Ethan Carter's teammates spoke of his kindness, his infectious smile, and his dreams of playing college basketball. One teacher described the selflessness of a colleague who had shielded students with her own body, sacrificing her life in the process. The stories were heart-wrenching, each one adding to the collective grief. But amidst the sorrow, anger began to surface. Some directed it at Colt's parents, questioning how they could have missed the signs. Others blamed the school for not providing adequate mental health resources. And then there were those who pointed fingers at the broader societal issues: easy access to firearms, a culture of bullying, and the stigmatization of mental illness. The community was fractured, united in grief but divided on the solutions. Protests erupted outside City Hall, with some demanding immediate gun reform, while others defended the Second Amendment. Social media became a battleground with hashtags like "Justice for the Victims" and the "Stop the Violence" trending nationwide. The shooting became more than a local tragedy. It was a flashpoint in a national conversation that had been building for years. The interrogation of Colt Gray continued, each moment revealing new layers of unease and confusion. The detective sitting across from him couldn't reconcile the boy they saw, a quiet, unassuming 14-year-old, with the calculated act of violence he had carried out. Every answer Colt gave seemed to raise more questions. His voice was flat, emotionless, as though he were describing something mundane, not the horror that had left his school and community shattered. "Did you plan this alone?" one of the detectives asked, his voice steady but firm. He leaned forward, searching Colt's face for any flicker of remorse or doubt. Colt looked up, his expression blank. "Yes." "And why today? Why not last week or next month?" the detective pressed. Colt shrugged, the movement almost casual. It just felt right. The simplicity of his answers was unnerving. It was as if the weight of what he had done didn't register, as if he couldn't grasp the enormity of the lives he had destroyed. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They'd interrogated hardened criminals before, people who lied, cried, or lashed out in anger. But Colt wasn't like them. He was a child, calm, detached, and eerily composed. Meanwhile, outside the station, the investigation into Colt's life deepened. Friends, classmates, and teachers were interviewed, each trying to make sense of what had led to this moment. Colt's middle school teachers described him as a quiet but bright student, someone who never caused trouble but didn't stand out either. His high school teachers, however, painted a different picture. Over the past year, they had noticed subtle changes: withdrawn behavior, declining grades, and a growing tendency to isolate himself. Still, none of it seemed alarming enough to raise red flags. Colt's classmates were equally baffled. Many described him as a loner, someone who rarely joined conversations or participated in activities. "He was just there," one student said. "Not mean, not friendly, just kind of invisible." But others had noticed more troubling signs. One student recalled a cryptic conversation in the weeks leading up to the shooting. He said something like, "People are going to remember me someday," the student explained, his voice trembling. "I thought he was just joking, but now, I don't know." Another classmate described Colt's social media posts, which had taken a darker turn in recent months. Cryptic messages like, "They don't see me now, but they will," and "Silence doesn't mean weakness," were scattered across his profiles. At the time, they had seemed like typical teenage angst, but now they carried an ominous weight. As the investigators pieced together Colt's life, they uncovered something even more chilling: a private online journal he had kept for the past year. The entries revealed a boy grappling with feelings of inadequacy, anger, and loneliness. He wrote about being ignored by his peers, feeling overshadowed by his siblings, and the resentment he harbored toward his parents for what he perceived as their constant criticism. But what stood out most were the entries in the weeks leading up to the shooting. They weren't just expressions of frustration, they were detailed plans. "Today I watched them laugh like I wasn't there," one entry read. "But they'll see me soon. They'll all see me." Another entry, dated just days before the attack, sent chills through the investigators. "I've figured it all out. The timing, the place, the moment when they'll finally notice me. I'm ready now." The discovery of the journal left little doubt that Colt's actions were premeditated. It wasn't a moment of blind rage or a snap decision. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of bottled-up emotions and meticulous planning. But what drove him to this point? That was the question everyone wanted answered. The media coverage of the case was relentless. News outlets dissected every aspect of Colt's life, from his childhood photos to his social media activity. Pundits debated the societal factors that might have contributed to his actions, while psychologists weighed in on the potential mental health issues Colt might have faced. The narrative wasn't just about a school shooting anymore. It was about the broader implications for a society grappling with a generation of disconnection, bullying, and untreated emotional pain. Amidst the media frenzy, President Biden addressed the nation in an emotional press conference. His voice cracked as he spoke about the victims and their families. "We cannot continue to let this happen," he said. "Our children deserve to feel safe in their schools. Our communities deserve to heal. And we as a nation must do better." Biden's call for action reignited the ongoing debate about gun control and mental health resources. Advocates pushed for stricter legislation, arguing that no 14-year-old should ever have access to a firearm. Opponents countered with calls for increased school security and mental health support. The divide was as wide as ever, with no clear path forward. Celebrities also weighed in, their voices amplifying the conversation. Talk show host Ellen DeGeneres shared a heartfelt message on her platform, urging viewers to support mental health initiatives. Meanwhile, actor Chris Evans tweeted, "We need to protect our kids. This isn't about politics. It's about humanity. Enough is enough." But for the families of the victims, the national conversation offered little comfort. They were left to grapple with the unthinkable loss of their loved ones. Ethan Carter's parents, Karen and Tom, spoke publicly for the first time during a community vigil. Standing on the makeshift stage, Karen's voice trembled as she described her son. "Ethan was more than just a student or a basketball player," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He was a light in our lives, a boy who dreamed of making the world better. And now we'll never get to see those dreams come true." Tom Carter placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, his own grief visible in the tightness of his jaw. "We're here tonight not just to remember Ethan, but to demand change," he said. "We can't bring him back, but we can fight to make sure no other family has to go through this." As the community mourned, Colt's parents faced their own version of hell. They released a brief statement expressing their condolences to the victims' families and asking for privacy. But the public wasn't ready to forgive. Protesters gathered outside their home, demanding answers and accountability. "How could you not see this coming?" one sign read. Another simply said, "Blood on your hands." Inside their house, Colt's parents struggled to process what had happened. His mother, Lydia, spent hours poring over old photos and report cards, searching for signs she might have missed. His father, David, retreated into silence, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on him. They had always thought of Colt as a quiet, thoughtful boy, someone who preferred books to sports, solitude to socializing. How could they have been so wrong? The question loomed over everyone. Was Colt Gray a monster, or was he a victim too? And as the trial loomed on the horizon, the world braced itself for the answers. As the investigation into Colt Gray deepened, the attention of the nation remained fixated on the chilling details of his life and the tragedy he had caused. The media frenzy only intensified as more information emerged, with every new piece of evidence drawing the public further into the horrifying reality of what had occurred. Yet even amidst the growing pile of facts and theories, one question persisted. Why? Why would a 14-year-old boy, seemingly ordinary to those around him, carry out an act so incomprehensible? Colt's journal entries, which had been leaked to the press, became the centerpiece of public scrutiny. Words scrawled in uneven handwriting were splashed across screens and front pages, their haunting messages debated and dissected. Phrases like, "They'll notice me when it's too late, and I'll finally be free from the noise," sent shockwaves through the nation. These entries painted the picture of a boy consumed by isolation, anger, and despair. But they also hinted at a deeper, more unsettling truth. Investigators found that Colt's digital footprint told an equally troubling story. In the months leading up to the tragedy, he had been active on obscure online forums and chat rooms, many of which were havens for disillusioned young people grappling with similar feelings of alienation. In these digital spaces, Colt wasn't just another forgotten teenager. He was heard, validated, and in some cases encouraged. Conversations unearthed by authorities revealed exchanges where Colt expressed his frustrations, his feelings of invisibility, and chillingly his growing fascination with violence. One chat in particular stood out. "What if I could make them all see?" Colt had typed to a user who went by the pseudonym Shadowed Truth. The response was equally chilling. Sometimes you have to be the loudest voice in the room to get them to listen. Experts were called in to analyze the psychological profile of a child like Colt. Theories abounded, ranging from undiagnosed mental health conditions to the impact of bullying, societal neglect, and exposure to harmful online communities. Dr. Karen Fletcher, a forensic psychologist interviewed on a major news outlet, explained, "Colt Gray represents a confluence of factors. He's not just a product of his individual experiences. He's a reflection of a larger systemic failure to recognize and address the struggles of our youth. This doesn't absolve him of responsibility, but it raises critical questions about the role we all play in these tragedies." As the investigation unfolded, the story became more than just about Colt. The lives of the victims and their families took center stage, their grief and loss serving as a painful reminder of the human cost of Colt's actions. Ethan Carter's parents became vocal advocates for change, using their platform to demand stricter gun control laws and better mental health resources. Karen Carter's emotional plea during a televised interview resonated with millions. "This isn't just about my son," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's about every child who goes to school expecting to learn, to grow, to live, and ends up paying the ultimate price. How many more Ethans do we have to lose before something changes?" Ethan's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace, became an unexpected symbol of resilience. During a candlelight vigil, she stood clutching a photograph of her brother, her small voice trembling as she spoke. "Ethan always told me to be brave," she said. "So I'm going to be brave for him, for all of us." The community rallied around the families of the victims, but the wounds were raw and the healing process was slow. Memorials were erected outside the school, adorned with flowers, notes, and photographs of the lives lost. The sight of grieving parents, friends, and classmates standing in silence was a stark contrast to the bustling school hallways that once echoed with laughter and chatter. Meanwhile, Colt's parents struggled to come to terms with their own reality. The media painted them as negligent, out-of-touch parents who had failed to notice the warning signs. Protesters outside their home demanded justice, their chants a constant reminder of the world's anger. Yet inside their home, the picture was far more complex. Lydia Gray, Colt's mother, had kept almost every piece of artwork and school project he had ever made. She spent hours in Colt's room sifting through his belongings in a futile search for answers. His favorite books, his notebooks, the posters on his walls. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was always so quiet, she whispered to herself one night, tears streaming down her face. How could I not have known? David Gray, Colt's father, turned to anger to mask his guilt. We did everything we could for him, he told a family friend in one of the rare moments he spoke about the tragedy. But maybe everything wasn't enough, or maybe he was just broken. Public opinion on the Grays was divided. Some sympathized with them, arguing that they were victims too, parents who had lost their child in a different way. Others were less forgiving, blaming them for Colt's actions and accusing them of enabling his descent into darkness. Amidst the chaos, a new development in the investigation threatened to deepen the wounds. A classmate of Colt's came forward with an unsettling revelation. He wasn't bullied the way everyone thinks, the student claimed during an interview. He didn't just snap because people were mean to him. He wanted this. He planned it. This statement sent shockwaves through the case, raising questions about Colt's motivations and challenging the narrative of him as a victim of circumstance. Was Colt simply a lost boy seeking validation, or was he something far more sinister? The answer remained elusive, but the nation couldn't look away. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, legal experts, and members of the community eager to witness the trial of Colt Gray. The 14-year-old who had become the face of a national tragedy now sat at the defense table, dwarfed by the weight of the legal system and the public scrutiny aimed squarely at him. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Some saw a boy lost and broken. Others saw a monster. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case, painting a chilling picture of premeditation. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared, their voice sharp and unyielding. Colt Gray meticulously planned his actions. He researched, prepared, and executed a plan that left 3 innocent people dead and a community forever scarred. The prosecutor displayed Colt's journal on the large courtroom screen, zooming in on entries that spoke of revenge and a desperate desire to make people notice him. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting through any lingering hope that this could be explained as an act of impulse. Witnesses were called to the stand, each testimony adding layers to the narrative. Teachers spoke of Colt as a quiet, withdrawn student, one who rarely caused trouble but seemed to harbor a simmering resentment. One teacher described an incident where Colt had lashed out verbally during a classroom debate, his words revealing a deep cynicism about humanity. He said, "People only care when it's too late," the teacher recounted. "At the time, I thought it was just teenage angst. Now I wonder if it was something more." Classmates painted a more complex picture. Some described him as a loner, bullied and ostracized, while others claimed he had shown a fascination with violence, often drawing disturbing images in his notebooks. He wasn't just a victim, one student testified. He scared people. We all knew something wasn't right, but no one knew what to do. The defense, however, sought to humanize Colt, arguing that he was a product of neglect and systemic failures. Colt's mother, Lydia, took the stand, her voice trembling as she described her son's struggles. "He was a sweet boy once," she said, clutching a tissue in her hands. "But something changed. He became distant, angry. I begged him to talk to me, but he wouldn't. I didn't know how to reach him." The defense presented evidence of Colt's mental health struggles, bringing in a psychologist who testified about the long-term effects of isolation and untreated depression in adolescence. Colt Gray's actions are inexcusable, the psychologist admitted, but they are also explainable. This was a boy crying out for help in the most horrific way imaginable. The trial took a dramatic turn when the defense introduced evidence of Colt's online activity, revealing that he had been influenced by a dark corner of the internet. Forums glorifying violence and despair had become Colt's refuge, and in these spaces, he had found validation for his darkest thoughts. The revelation sparked outrage and debate, both inside and outside the courtroom. "How do we let these spaces exist?" one commentator on a popular news program asked. "These platforms prey on vulnerable minds, and the results are catastrophic. Colt Gray may have pulled the trigger, but who else is responsible?" As the trial progressed, the focus shifted to the victims and their families. The parents of Ethan Carter, the star athlete whose life was cut short, took the stand, their grief palpable. Ethan's father, Mark, addressed Colt directly during his testimony. "You took my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just kill him, you shattered our family. But I hope somehow you find the strength to understand what you've done and why you did it. Because without that, none of this will ever make sense." The courtroom was silent as Ethan's mother, Karen, recounted her last moments with her son. "He told me he loved me before he left for school that morning," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it would be the last time I'd hear his voice." The testimonies brought the human cost of Colt's actions into sharp focus. It wasn't just about the loss of life, it was about the ripple effects on families, friends, and an entire community struggling to make sense of the senseless. Public opinion remained deeply divided. On social media, heated debates raged in comment sections and hashtags. Was Colt Gray a victim of a broken system, or was he inherently evil? Should he be tried as an adult, or was there hope for rehabilitation? The arguments were passionate, often vitriolic, but they reflected the complexity of a case that had no easy answers. One particularly controversial moment came when President Biden addressed the tragedy during a town hall meeting. "This is a failure on every level," he said. "We failed Colt Gray as a society, and we failed the victims of this horrific act. We need to take a hard look at how we're supporting our youth and what we're doing to prevent tragedies like this." The statement drew both praise and backlash, with some accusing the president of sympathizing with Colt, while others applauded his willingness to confront the broader issues at play. Celebrities also weighed in, adding fuel to the fire. A well-known actor tweeted, "Colt Gray's actions are horrifying, but he's also a kid who has failed at every turn. This should make us angry at the system, not just him." Meanwhile, a prominent athlete posted, "Justice for the victims, that's all that matters." As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere grew even more charged. The prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments, each making a final plea to the jury. Colt Gray made a choice, the prosecutor declared. A choice that ended lives and shattered families. He must be held accountable. The defense countered with a plea for understanding. Colt Gray is not beyond redemption, they argued. He is a child who fell through the cracks of a society that should have caught him. Punish the crime, yes, but don't lose sight of the humanity. The jury's deliberation was tense, the weight of the nation's scrutiny pressing down on them. In homes across America, families debated the case, their conversations reflecting the same conflicts playing out in the courtroom. What does justice look like in a case like this? And how do we prevent it from happening again? The trial of Colt Gray wasn't just about one boy or one act of violence. It was a mirror held up to society, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, gun violence, and the consequences of neglect. As viewers of this story, we are left with the same questions. What could have been done differently? And how do we move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation together. If this story has resonated with you, subscribe to join a community committed to understanding, learning, and advocating for change.